All right, we're about ready to start the second panel. This morning we talked about BITS and the key issues that are involved in the negotiations between the United States and China. But of course, investment is done by firms. And so this panel will focus on implications for manufacturing and for services. And indeed, for services, investment is a crucial part of the equation. We have three speakers for the second panel, and hopefully we will have very succinct and informative presentations that will allow us time for a lengthy question and answer. I will introduce each speaker before he or she speaks. We will start with Dr. Han Bing, who is a senior research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, where she is with the Institute of World Economics and Politics. She holds a doctoral degree from China University of Political Science and Law and a Master of Law from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. We're very pleased to have her with us today. You can, wherever you're more comfortable, you can speak here or at the podium. Oh, then you better go to the podium.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to attend today's conference. And the topic of my presentation is the outlook for negative listings of China and U.S. bilateral investment treaty. Last year, Okay. Oh, yeah. In July last year, at the China and the U.S. meeting of the strategic and economic dialogue, the two countries committed to initiate the negative list negotiation early in 2015 based on each other's negative list offers. At this stage, the negative list has become one of the core issues of the China and the U.S. BIT negotiations. In 2013, Shanghai opens the China-Shanghai Pilot Free Trade Zone, and the Shanghai municipal government has announced the special administrative measures on foreign investment access to the China Pilot Free Trade Zone, which is the first negative list in China and a big step forward in China's reform of foreign investment management. Last year, Shanghai municipal government has published the revised version of the special administrative measures. To provide an outlook for the negative listing of China and U.S. BIT, it needs to give analysis of the implication and application of the negative list approach and the regulation, obligation, and the effects of Shanghai FTZ negative list, as well as a comparative study upon the two Shanghai FTZ negative lists and the negative list of 2012 U.S. Model Bilateral Investment Treaty. So the main content of my report includes these 5 parts. Considering the time requirements, I will mainly introduce the 4th part, the outlook for the negative listings of China and U.S. BIT. Before we talk an outlook for the China and the U.S. Negative list, we need to know the differences between the Shanghai FTZ negative lists and the negative list of China and the U.S. BIT. There's they are mainly reflected in the following 4 areas. First is the effects. We know that the negative list in the US and China bid will be the international law, while the Shanghai FTA negative list is national law. The second difference is the revision. The negative list in the US and China bid may have the effect in 10 years, and the revision of it needed two contracting countries' formal negotiation, whilst the Shanghai FTA negative list can be amended according to the practice. The third difference is the contents. Provided that the China and US bid be concluded in accordance with the US model bid, the negative list in the China and US bid will include the reservations on the obligation of national treatment, most favored nation treatment, performance requirements, senior management, and boards of directors, whereas the Shanghai negative list merely concerns the liberation commitments of national treatment. The last difference is the dispute settlement. We know that in the event that the investor incurs damage by reason of the host country breaching an obligation under the China and US bid, the investor may submit a claim to international arbitration in accordance with the regulations, investor-state dispute settlement. While under the Shanghai FTA negative list, the investor may seek relief through the domestic judiciary. Based on the above analysis of the differences between the two Shanghai FTA negative lists and the negative list of China and the US bid, this report intends to outline the general framework to the negative list of China and the US bid and make the following recommendations to it. The first one is that it could be argued that the Shanghai FTA negative lists would be the basis for offering the negative listings of China and the US bid by China. We know at present the Shanghai FTA become a test field for pushing forward reform, improving the level of an open economy. So it may provide some references to the negative listing of China and the US bid. Secondly, the negative list of China and US bid would include more non-conforming measures than that of the Shanghai FTA negative lists. As noted above, the Shanghai FTA negative lists simply include the non-conforming measures remained for the obligation of national treatment, while the negative list of China and US bid involves the reservations for the most favored nation treatment, performance requirement, and etc., besides the national treatment. Thirdly, it is recommended that the China and the US bid adopt the international accepted classification method in its negative list. Currently, as for foreign investment, there are differences in industrial classification in different policy documents in China. The differences in industrial classification are easily caused the confusions in the implementation process. So it is suggested that the negative list of China and the US bid apply international accepted classification. Lastly, it is considered that the negotiation of the non-conforming measures in services shall be the most important and difficult issue in the upcoming negotiation of negative listings of China and US bid. We know that in that of UNCTAD study, of the 4,806 non-conforming measures scheduled under the 8 sample IRA international investment agreements, the share of non-conforming measures in services is 71%, and the number of reservations for services is 6 times higher than the number of reservations for primary industries. So, so the impact in the negotiations on negative listings of China and US bid in this year would be a rocky road. It is worth to noting that China signals further liberation of services according to the decision on major issue concerning comprehensive deepening reforms, which were adopted by the third plenary session of the 18th CPC Central Committee. It states that the finance, education, culture, and medical sectors will enjoy an orderly opening up to market access, while nursery, pension, architecture, design, accounting and auditing, trade and logistics, and e-commerce investment restrictions will be eased. Further liberation will be achieved in general manufacturing. Further, according to the regular press conference of the Ministry of Commerce in January this year, the Ministry of Commerce says that this year it will vigorously implement these decisions. So to sum up, owing to the different levels of economic development and the differences in regulatory approaches between the two governments, the two sides in the negative listings negotiation is thought to be too difficult. Nevertheless, if both sides uphold the principles of win-win cooperation agreement, in particular, the parties fully respect each other's national conditions and accord more flexibility in the negotiation of the negative list, a balanced win-win and the high-level China and US bid will be eventually reached. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Han. Our next speaker is Brad Jensen, who is a professor of economics and international business at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He's also a senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's taught at Carnegie Mellon. He has worked at the U.S. Census Bureau. He has gotten his PhD at a small school in Northern California called Stanford. And last but not least, he is the author of the important chapter on services in the Institute's new briefing on the U.S.-China investment treaty. So well worth reading Brad's contribution and the other contributions from this publication. Brad, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So I'd like to take a few minutes and try to persuade you that there's an important win-win opportunity for China and the U.S. to increase growth in both countries by increasing trade and services. China's economy, I think growth is being held back by the lack of a large, robust, efficient service sector. To grow faster, China needs access to more efficient and cheaper business services. The U.S., for its part, needs to grow faster, and we need to balance our trade, so we need to export more. We happen to have a large and globally competitive service sector. China has relatively high barriers to services trade, and importantly, for our purposes today, for the Bilateral Investment Treaty, it has particularly high barriers to foreign entry. So this seems like an important opportunity by liberalizing foreign direct investment through the BIT it could lay the foundation for increased trade and services to both countries' benefit. So I think there is growing recognition in China that growth is hampered by the lack of a robust service sector. And if we compare China to the other developed economies, we see that service sectors are an important piece of an advanced economy. And if we look at China, I guess the coloring didn't come out too well, but we see that in terms of the overall economy, services account for about 35 or 36% of employment in China. Okay, the data for China overall is not very detailed. If we look at urban China, where more detail is available, we see that even in urban China, the service sector only accounts for about 44% of employment. And an important category within services is a category called business services. This is things like telecommunications, finance, insurance, software, professional, scientific, and technical services. These services are very important intermediate inputs into the economy writ large, whether it be the manufacturing sector or other service sectors. And we look at the business service sector. In urban China, the business service sector only accounts for about 11% of employment. In contrast, if we look at the United States, the service sector accounts for about 85% of employment in the United States. So the United States is a service economy. And if we look at that important category of business services, we see that it accounts for over 20% of employment in the United States. So we have, in this country, a large business service sector. When we look at the productivity of the service sector, now the measuring this is difficult. The data is not as robust as one would like, but this is work from my colleague Mark Noland and co-authors that looks at labor productivity. The top row is the OECD, and the highlighted row is China. And what we see is that there is a large differential in terms of labor productivity in the service sector between the OECD and China. And I would argue, while I don't have data to back this up, that the US would be at the high end in terms of labor productivity in the OECD. So that the gap between the US and China in terms of services productivity is quite large. The US, I believe, has comparative advantage in services, and the US, in contrast to its large and persistent trade deficit in goods, the US has a growing and persistent trade surplus in the service sector. Again, suggesting that the US has a globally competitive service sector. Okay, now, what is the underlying source of this difference in the service sector between the United States and China? I don't think that there's anything intrinsic about Americans versus Chinese. I think it goes back to history, and that is that the US has been on the forefront of educational attainment, and it turns out that business services are very skill intensive. So when we look in the United States at workers within tradable service industries, we see that they're twice as likely to have a college degree as workers in the manufacturing sector. So these are highly skilled workers. So tradable business services, these important business services, these important intermediate inputs are very skill intensive. It turns out that historically the United States has been relatively skill abundant relative to even other developed economies. So this bubble chart plots out average educational attainment for 60 to 65-year-olds for a number of important countries in the world. And what you see is that for people who are at the peak of their careers at this point, the United States, and this has been true even further back in the past, has been an outlier in terms of educational attainment. So the United States is skill abundant, historically. Okay, so I think that's why we observe the patterns that we observe today. Now, history is not destiny. Right? And if we look at what's happening with educational attainment in China, we see that China has made rapid increases in average educational attainment. So the green bubbles are 25 to 29-year-olds. And you see that educational attainment among 25 to 29-year-olds in China is rapidly converging with levels in the developed world. Okay, so this will solve that services problem eventually. But it may take decades for this educational attainment to work its way through the labor force. And what I argue is that in the meantime, it makes sense to trade. There are gains to trade between the United States and China that would allow the United States to export more, to reduce its trade deficit, and would facilitate faster growth in China. Now, an important impediment to this increased trade is trade policy in China. Now, measuring impediments to services trade is very difficult, but the OECD has had an ongoing project where they have attempted to do this. And here is data for China, and I'll just note a couple things. The black triangles are average impediments to services trade among OECD countries. And what you see is that China has relatively high barriers to services trade. Okay? In all of the 18 categories, China is above the OECD average. So China has high barriers to services trade. In addition, and what's important for thinking about a bilateral investment treaty, the bottom part of the bar, the orange part, that is what the OECD rates as restrictions on foreign ownership. And we see that restrictions on foreign ownership are a very important component of the high barriers to services trade in China. Okay, so reducing these barriers to foreign investment through a bilateral investment treaty would lay the foundation for increased trade and services to both countries' benefits. Okay, and now while a BIT is an obvious prerequisite for increased foreign direct investment, okay, and foreign direct investment, commercial presence, or Mode 3, is very important for the delivery of many services. So for certain types of services, foreign direct investment is really the only way to trade services. So this is an important impediment to Mode 3 trade. But just to remind you, there are other modes of trade that I think are also impeded by the lack of foreign entry. So Mode 1 is, think of digital services, software, right? It could be produced anywhere in the world and shipped to China. But often for high-end business services, software customization is facilitated by a local office. So to really deliver that Mode 1, you need some Mode 3, okay? Or Mode 4, to deliver that high-end service, whether it be software services, finance or insurance, telecommunications. You often need the temporary movement of corporate executives to support the sales, to provide technical assistance. Okay? Again, having a local presence can help. Okay, so we've often talked about these four modes as being distinct channels of services trade, and while there's no real data on this that I'm aware of, I'm increasingly convinced that all channels need to be functional for the delivery of modern business services. Okay, so when I think about higher education, an area where I think the United States has a comparative advantage, and I look at Georgetown where I work, For us to be successful as an institution of higher education, we really need access to all four modes. We need to provide online delivery. We need to have students come from abroad to Georgetown's campus here in Washington, D.C. We need to establish campuses around the world. We need the movement of professors around the world to support education around the world. So for us to deliver a successful 21st century higher education experience, we need all four modes to work. If we can't, if one of those modes is missing, it kind of shuts off the whole enterprise. So that's where I think for the BIT, these restrictions on foreign entry are very important. They will obviously preclude Mode 3 delivery, but I think that they will impede all the other types of service delivery as well. So just in conclusion, I think there's a big win-win opportunity for China and the US to increase growth in both countries by increasing trade and services. Reducing the impediments to foreign direct investment is an important prerequisite to increase services trade. I think a robust US-China BIT with very few exceptions, make sure that negative list is short, could play an important role in facilitating this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. We are very fortunate now to have as our third speaker Dr. Zhang Fan. Dr. Zhang is a professor of the National School of Development at Peking University. He has his PhD, which he received in 1994 from Wayne State University. After his PhD, he went back to China and joined a group of scholars to create the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University. He's a professor and teaches macroeconomics, urban economics, and economics of antitrust and regulation. We're very pleased to have you at our podium.
Thank you. The potential impacts of BIT on China's manufacturing industries. My co-author is Professor Yu Miaojie. He is not here, he's in Hong Kong. China benefited a lot from manufacturing industries in the past 30 years. But now, it is not the most hot topic, but China still needs manufacturing sectors. So our idea is that we don't quite know the potential impacts of BIT, but the manufacturing sector has already opened up to the world since China joined WTO. So it is a good example to show what can happen when a sector or industry opened up to the world. It is a natural experiment. So we will talk about the impacts and some suggestions. So our basic idea is the manufacturing sector do not need to be protected except for limited fields related to national security, scarce natural resources, and well-defined strategic sectors. So first, let's see some facts. Here, this is the old version of the PPT. It is wrong. It should be the flow FDI in all sectors actually reached 117 billion in 2013. I think Peterson Institute had some stock, the numbers of the stock of FDI. But the FDI in the manufacturing sector has grown much slower than the average. You can see the blue ones are the manufacturing sector, the FDIs. The red ones are non-manufacturing sectors. So since 2005, there's not much change for the manufacturing sector. And here's some numbers about the US from the Chinese source. may be different from other sources. You can see the share of U.S. Direct investment in China reduced dramatically from 10% to about something around 2%. Probably there's some effect. For example, some of the investors just invest through other countries. This is possible, but there's still a domestic reduction. I want just to report some impacts. We did some econometric analysis. We used a large database, firm-level database, collected by the China's National Bureau of Statistics from 2000. Actually, we used to 2007. It includes over 2 million firm-level observations. And the first econometrics analysis, I will skip the details, but the first analysis of the inward FDI on domestic firms, we find overall FDI has a positive impact on firms' productivity and profitability. Then the U.S. impact will be smaller because the U.S. has a smaller share. Then we see the specific industries. This chart shows different two-digit industries. You see the blue ones, the blue color shows the proportion of foreign invested enterprises. So in some industries, it is very large, like industry number 39. That is the computer and the information technology industry. We found that direct impacts of FDI on firms' productivity are positive for almost all industries. We look for different specific industries. And we find the indirect impacts in some industries are negative. So what is the direct impacts? If you are a FDI firm, if you are a foreign invested firm, then we will expect a higher productivity for that firm. The indirect impacts, if the industry has a larger share of foreign direct investment, then the average productivity will be positive or negative, and we find some negative effects. So we find some vulnerable industries, labor-intensive industries, like shoe production, large technology gaps with the world frontier, such as the pharmaceutical industries, and industries with environmental problems. Okay, this is the first econometrics analysis. Then we did another econometrics on the to see the policy changes on the FDI. We collect the information of restricted and forbidden items in China's category of guiding FDI. That's a Chinese policies list. That's a positive list in the past several years. And we find if 10 out of 51 restricted and forbidden items are lifted, the total FDI will increase by about 4%. It is not very big. Then the third econometrics analysis, the BIT's impacts on China's outward investment. We find the outward direct investment has increased the productivity of the parent company. If the firm invests outward, its productivity will be higher. And also, it can raise the productivity of other firms in the industry. That's the three econometrics analysis we did. And we have some suggestions on firms' negotiation strategies. First, China needs to be clear that China is serious in joining the BIT, and I believe it is true. And the second, some protection measures were needed in the long run, including the fields related to national security, related to natural resources, and a limited number of strategic sectors. These protections are needed, but the rules should be clear, should be accurate, and should be small, limited. And then there are some others. In the short run, maybe need some gradual lifting process for some protection measures. And also need cooperation of the BIT negotiation with the domestic reform. For example, if you give the foreign firm national treatment, then some of the items can be dropped from the list, because you can use domestic regulation to deal with that. And then we have some suggestion for the firms. They need to learn to use the BIT to enter the fields that are not open to domestic firms in China by current regulation, because they can use BIT to get national treatment. And also the domestic firms need to have their firm-level global strategy and go outside. We also have some suggestion for the government. The conclusions, the overall effect of BIT, and therefore the FDI, and thereby the BIT on the Chinese manufacturing sector is positive. And then if the signing of BIT is part of the process of a more widespread domestic reform, then in fact the gains may be larger. And the manufacturing industry as a whole do not need to be protected except for the fields, for well-defined, limited fields. And gradual lifting of protection may be needed in the short run for a small number of vulnerable industries. So overall, I think my story is that the manufacturing industry is a successful story to show what will happen if a sector opened up to the world economy, and how the government and the business to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. All our speakers have been very disciplined in using the time. So that leaves us about 25 minutes for questions from the audience. And what I would suggest is just raise your hand, and when you get the microphone, please introduce yourself before asking the question. We're open actually for the broad range of questions that have been on issues that have been raised throughout this conference today. So we look forward for discussion. First question. Nick.
Nick Lardy, Peterson. I'd address the question to Professor Zhang and also to Professor Jensen. Professor Zhang, you mentioned that once the BIT is established, that indigenous domestic firms could use the national treatment argument to enter into certain restricted sectors, particularly in services. So if China were to sign a BIT, could either of you say something about to what extent do you think the space in an expanded service sector would be filled up by indigenous private firms that are also restricted from entering into things like telecom and financial services, and how much of the space would be filled up by foreign firms? I don't know any methodology for estimating this, so I'm just interested in your impressions.
the analysis. I think probably a large part of the sector will be filled up by domestic firms. As you mentioned, like in the telecommunication, in the banking sector, but it depends. It depends how the process is still a long way to go. First, the two countries need to sign a treaty, and then it depends how the Chinese government to inform it domestically. But theoretically, this is possible for those Chinese firms, because people talk about the national treatment, because before some of the foreign firms get better than national treatment than domestic firms. So it is theoretically possible. I think that the most, if it is implemented, the domestic firms will be occupy a large part of the sector.
So I don't know the answer either, and I think it would depend on the whole suite of public policy and regulation and accreditation and licensing that might not be part of a traditional BIT. So I've heard stories. I am not a China expert. I'm study the U.S., but in talking to U.S. multinationals, you hear stories of, yes, we're allowed to enter, so a bank can enter, but every time they want to establish a new ATM, they need a new license. So if there are distinctions in the way that regulators treat domestic firms versus foreign firms in terms of adding locations, then in spite of national treatment within the BIT, this other kind of behind the border barrier might make it difficult for foreign firms to enter as robustly as they might otherwise. So I think that this is, I think, an issue with services. It's more acute with services than with goods, though certainly an issue with goods. The kind of behind the border issues loom very large. And as I mentioned with the four modes, I think there is a web of domestic regulation that can impede service firms entering a market, even when national treatment is given in terms of commercial presence.
I can give answer to this question. According to the State Council's document which published last year, name is Opinions of the State Council on Promoting Fair Market Competition and Maintaining the Normal Market Order. It states that the negative lists for market access shall be formulated in China, and the State Council will clearly set out in the form of lists the sectors, fields, and business, among others, where investments and operations are prohibited or restricted. The various market participants may all legally gain access to those outside of the negative lists. So the private companies will also benefit from the BIT, I think, in this way. Thank you.
Next question, Uri.
Yeah, Uri Dadush, Carnegie again. So 2 questions, one for Professor Zhang and Dr. Han, which is, according to your analysis, the effect of the BIT on manufacturing FDI into China from the United States will be trivial, very, very small. And the big effect is on domestic reforms in China. So my question is, why don't you just do the domestic reforms? Why do you need the bid? The question for Professor Jensen is, in a sense, the opposite, which is you have talked about all the opportunities for exporting into China services. But we know that the big gains from trade come from own reforms, own liberalization, etc. You didn't mention at all what the US would have to do in terms of making its own system more efficient. Maybe the assumption is that we have already reached nirvana, in which case you don't have to answer.
I think first about the number. My number is the flu FDI. From US is about 2.4% in 2013. It may be underestimated. It is from the official Chinese Statistics Bureau. For example, people may come invest from other countries to China. I think Peterson has another data that's for the stock. The stock FDI in China, the number is 1.2%. In the total stock, the U.S. occupied 1.2, but the number may be underestimated. Second, about why you do not do domestic reform directly, why you want to do to send BIT to how to say to persuade the government to do the reform. I think that's a question of about the Chinese domestic economy. I mean, political economy. And through the 30 years in the past, in the Chinese reform process, there are a lot of cases. It is very difficult to do the reform domestically, directly. So sometimes you need to go another way, like join the WTO to open the market, to use the international standards in the domestic market. I think that's that happens a lot in China. Thank you.
Dr. Han,
I can give one example. We know that the negative list based management is an institutional innovation, which marks the huge, although it marks the huge change of China's foreign investment system, but it is also is a trend moving for China's foreign investment management to moving closer to the international high standard of investment rules. Thank you.
Brad, are we in nirvana? It doesn't feel like it.
No, I don't think we're in nirvana, and I think that's a good question. I guess I would take a step back from it and say that when thinking about the bilateral relationship between the United States and China, I think that both the United States and China have benefited enormously from the liberalization of goods trade. And that in that liberalization, and that you could think of the accession, MFN and then the accession to the WTO, United States consumers have benefited enormously from cheaper, more efficient Chinese-produced or assembled goods. And we have facilitated or enabled a significant reallocation out of manufacturing, which I don't think is a comparative advantage industry within the United States. So we've kind of That was then, and we liberalized goods trade. That was comparative advantage for China and not comparative advantage for the United States. We've benefited from that. So you could think of that as unilateral liberalization. So we did do that. Now on the services side, I think that China would benefit enormously, just like we did, from liberalizing goods trade. China would benefit enormously from allowing our globally competitive service providers access to their market. And they would see some dislocation, much like we did in the manufacturing sector, but their consumers and their businesses would benefit from these lower cost intermediate inputs. So that's kind of taking a step back. Now, on services barriers, no, the United States is not clean. I don't know that where we have issues, it's big in the US-China relationship. I think of them as being more US-EU issues. And you can think of, civilian air transport, maritime transport, and courier services are areas where the OECD ranks US impediments to trade and services is higher than the OECD average. So those are three areas that are, I don't think of those as looming large in the US-China bit negotiation. They're probably a US-Europe thing.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
It's a question first for Zhang Fan. You mentioned an important part of the negotiations will be, and China's contribution will be the identification of strategic sectors. What's your list of strategic sectors? You said they needed to be well defined, so I was wondering if you could give us your list. For Hanbing, you mentioned you talked about the negative list and sort of theoretically how it would be developed. Could you tell us a little bit about the actual process by which we should expect to see the negative list put forward by the Chinese government? Are they going to be taking the Shanghai FTZ negative list and then just simply marking lines off of it to come up with a new U.S.-China BIT negative list? Or, what government agencies and other stakeholders are going to participate in that process? Thanks.
I think it is a difficult question, and I think about that before, and I think it is quite difficult. Probably the national security sectors and the natural resources sectors have some overlap with the strategic sectors. So things like related to some natural resources, related to the oil, and also the natural and the security, like arm production. These sectors probably should be or maybe the nuclear energy production. But I think the list should be negotiated between the two countries. So I just have some my own idea, but it is not. It need to both sides to negotiate, and need to be clear, need to be limited.
The Shanghai FTZ is a test field for pushing forward reform in China, and it also published the negative lists to explore the application of pre-assessed national treatment and negative lists management mode. If it after this test, they will forms replicable and widely applicable experiences, and some of these experience will be extended to all of the nations. And on that basis, the government will develop the China's negative list. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, Irv.
Irving Williamson, Commissioner, U.S. International Trade Commission. I was wondering if the panelists could address the possible economic benefits to the United States from a bit, particularly in terms of increased employment in the U.S. And in that regard, if there's more Chinese investment in U.S. firms, is that going to mean more jobs in the U.S.? And Professor Jensen, if it's important that you have the liberalization in all four modes to have, so we say, the maximum benefits from a services agreement, what does that say about U.S. immigration and visa policies regarding how we're going to benefit from the agreement? Thank you.
You want to start, Brad?
Right, immigration.
It's good.
It is good. Immigration is good. And our immigration and visa system, if you can call it a system, is not serving the national interest. Yes, for us to export services, we need Mode 2. In higher ed, we need a rationalized visa system for students. You know, we're losing students to other parts of the world because it's hard to get in here, or it's hard for their parents to visit. So yeah, we need a better immigration system. In terms of jobs, economists don't think that trade creates jobs. It changes the type of jobs that are done in places. And we think that trade allows people to do the most efficient thing that they can. So I would expect a bit, if it were accompanied by the regulatory changes that would allow a robust U.S. service firm presence in China, to increase good jobs in the United States. I don't think it would increase the number of jobs, but it would increase the quality of the jobs.
I think in the past 20 years, Chinese manufacturers, their costs are very low, so they sell a lot of manufacturing products in the United States. So consumers here can buy cheap products. I remember I read a book written by a lady in about 2007 or 2006. It's about she has a plan to buy does not buy any made in China in 1 year. And she found it is very, very difficult. She made a lot of difficulties. So I think that's the benefit. For the employment or immigration, I think theoretically you do not need to get the benefits through immigration. You can trade is another channel to transfer the benefit, even without the immigration. But I don't know in the future. Probably this is too old an example.
I would just add a word on that, though it would be wonderful if your trade commission was asked by Congress to do a study that did a honest assessment of how these agreements could boost productivity in the U.S. economy, and that productivity growth would then create the opportunity to grow employment. That's the key. And in that way, what Brad and the other panelists were saying about the service sector is very important, because the service sector allows opening up that investment in the service sector allows the possibility of increased productivity growth, not only in services, but in manufacturing and in agriculture. So you can have it across the economy. And that, I think, is one of the key things that the BIT could do, or an FTA could do, in promoting economic growth. and over time employment growth in the partner economies. I think we have time for one last question, if there is one. One last one, and then we'll turn to President Posen.
I'm wondering if Dr. Han could elaborate more about the negative list. You mentioned the non-conforming measures in services. It may be the most difficult issues. And I don't quite catch that. Could you give some specific examples which service industries the U.S. are interested to enter, but China is not ready to fully open at this stage? Thanks.
Thank you. I just when I say that this would be the difficult issue during the China and the U.S. trade negotiations, I give the study by the UNCTAD. It obvious that from the past practices, most of the time they will discuss the services sectors for reservations. So from this perspective, I think it may be the difficult issue. And I also can give you data of that most of the time the transportation, banking, and the insurance, business services, and the communications, they are the most categories that in the negotiations of the bid. That's a data. It account for combined 82% of total non-conforming measures listed in the services sector in the 8 sample international investment agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of all my colleagues, can we offer our thanks to Jeff and everyone on this terrific last panel. Thank you very much. Look, if you'll allow me to wrap up, it's very helpful that our colleague from the ITC took us back to sort of the big picture. We've spent a lot of today, not in the weeds, in the very fruitful crops that go with really tilling the trade hardware, really, if you'll excuse the expression, fertilizing the ground for future growth. And I think it's important we do that. And I'm very grateful to the China Development Research Foundation, but especially my colleagues Jeff Schott and Sean Miner for leading our research effort on this and getting us into how feasible, in what way we can advance the cause of greater integration and the next logical step for that for China and the U.S. That said, as I said, we closed with the ITC and we opened with Lu Mai speaking about the big picture of U.S.-China relations. And I think it is important for us to all recognize that foreign direct investment in a free-flow way is one of the few relatively undisputed goods in international economics. That we sometimes talk about the pluses and minuses of fast-footed capital flows. We talk about the adjustment problems involved with migration and the need to look after people. We talk occasionally even about the displacement of trade and various standards. But we have a huge range of evidence, including with experience in China, including with experience in the US, that commercial direct investment transfers technology and know-how, promotes best practices, tends to raise wages, not just in developing countries, but in the US, tends to be a true win-win in a way with very little challenge. And I would argue in the spirit of both my senior colleagues sitting here at table one, that it has massive spillover effects in terms of political relations and trust as well. And so I'm very proud of the work we've done together on this. I'm very grateful to all of you for engaging with us on this important issue. And we look forward to not only continuing to work on these issues, but with our friends in Beijing, advancing this cause again next month with the CDRF. This meeting is adjourned.